Alright, this is just going to be a quick tutorial on basically how to use EOP and how to use some of the features of EOP. One of the things that I want to demonstrate today is changing the CAS models on the strategy map. So you can basically do this at any stage, whenever you want, using EOP's various different events that it has. So the first thing you want to do is install EOP. So I've already done this, and I've also covered this in another video, so I'm not going to go over it again, but I have EOP installed here in a vanilla copy of Divide and Conquer. And it's set up and everything correctly, which is also shown in the other video, so I'll leave a link to that in the description, and that's what you want to do first, is install EOP. And if you weren't aware, EOP works with any mods, so you just go to your Medieval 2 folder, your mods, and whatever mod folder, you drop it in here, set everything up, and you're good to go. So in order to change these CAS models on the map, we're going to need to use EOP to edit, to do that basically. So the way that we do that is we start off by going into Unoi data here, we go into plugins, we go into Lua, and we go into Lua plugin script.lua. So this is where you're going to write all your Lua scripts for EOP. And I've already opened this here in Visual Studio Code, so that's where we're going to start. So the first thing we're going to want to do is load our models. So now that we've got our Lua script that we're going to edit, open in whatever text editor you want to use. You're welcome to use Notepad++ if you want. I recommend using Visual Studio Code because it has a Lua extension which you can grab, which just makes things easier, and it will kind of highlight any errors that you might have as you write things. There's probably a thing for Notepad++ as well, but I'm not sure. So yeah, the first thing we're going to do is we want to load up the CAS models that we're going to use. So this is the documentation for EOP, and what we want to do is we want to add a model. So we have this function here called objects.addModel2Game, and that is part of the stratmap.objects table. So in order to get started, we need to call this function objects.addModel2Game, and then we're going to pass in the model path, which is going to be the path to your CAS file, and then we're going to give it a model ID that we can reference later on. So the question is, at what stage do we want to do this? Now, from what I've read and from what I understand, Unoi, the creator of EOP, recommends that you do this in one of EOP's event functions. So I believe he recommends on plugin load. Yeah, we have it here. So this is basically loaded when, this function is called when the game starts up. So as soon as you start the game, anything that's defined in here is going to be run. So in our case, we want to, as soon as the game starts, load up some models into the model database so that later on, when we're doing things on the campaign map, we can reference them. So in order to do that, to use that onPluginLoad function or event, we can just write function onPluginLoad. Just double check that that's right. Yep. And then we can do whatever we want to do in here, which in this case is going to be adding the models like I just talked about. So we can see here that we need to start off with stratmap.objects. That's our table. And this is available globally, so we don't need to do anything. We can just write stratmap.objects.addModel2Game. And then we need to pass in, as it says here, the path. Let's go down to this function. Yeah, perfect. So we actually have an example of it here. with the cast file referenced and then the ID. So the first argument is a string and the second is the ID. So let's say data models strat residences, and then in divide and conquer there's some in faction variance, and let's pick one. Excuse me, I just go to the mod folder quickly. Mods, divide and conquer, let's pin this. And we go to data, model strat, residences, faction variance, and let's pick one from here. Let's go in Ireland. And let's pick the elf castle. So we're going to copy that, put that in here. So that's the full path you can see up here to the cast file. Now that's relative to your mod folder, of course. And then we're going to give that an ID. So let's give that an ID of 1. So that's the first step done. So now that we have the model set up and ready to go in the model database, we want to use this model that we have in the database to replace another model. So imagine you have a settlement over here, for example, Kaelin had in Gondor, and you want to change the model based on some kind of event. Well, just like on plug and load, EOP has a bunch of events that you can use. I'll find them here. So these are all different types of events that can happen. So for example, on when the turn number changes, or when a faction gets a new capital, or when a city riots, or when you've completed a building, or when you've upgraded the settlement. That might be a good time to change the model. So we'll come back to settlement upgraded later. Right now we're just going to do on settlement selected, because that's going to be easier to test and demo than on settlement upgraded, but the principle is going to be exactly the same. So we're going to use this on settlement selected function. So we can click this and it will take us down here. There's no example here, but that's fine, we don't really need one. So yeah, on settlement selected. So this is going to be another event. Function on settlement selected end. Perfect. So now any code that's written in this function is going to be called whenever a settlement is selected. So let's test something very simple. Let's just print out settlement was selected. So we've written that, perfect, that looks good. Go back into Medieval 2, we'll open the EOP console, select the settlement. Okay, nothing happens. That's fine. That's because we haven't reloaded the script. So what we can do is we can press Control, 9 and 1 in that order, 3 keys, and that will reload the script. And then what we can do is we can press 1 again, select the settlement, and we can see now a settlement was selected. So now we know that this code here is always running whenever a settlement is selected. So now that we know that we can run certain code based on certain in-game events, why don't we try changing the model? So to change the model, we need to call the stratmap objects set model function. So if we go back to the documentation, we search for set model. You can see here, objects.setModel, and it takes a x coordinate and a y coordinate, and then the 2 model IDs. So the x coordinate is going to be the coordinate of the settlement, and the y coordinate, x and y coordinates, the coordinates of the settlement, just like you might, if you do show cursor, stat, you get these coordinates, so it's the same. So rather than having to, okay, so let's write the code for calling the set model. So we've already added the model to the game, now we want to set the model, so we can just grab this stratmap.objects.setModel. Perfect. And we know from looking at the documentation that that's going to take an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Okay, so we don't obviously want to have to hard code a bunch of values here, like 3, 4, 5, and and have this massive list of hard-coded coordinates. So what we can actually do, okay, my apologies, I've actually made a mistake here. So on settlement selected, if we go back to the documentation, we can actually see that this function has a parameter of a settlement, and this settlement is what's called a settlement struct. So this is like an object is another term for it, and this has a bunch of fields which we can access. So let's correct our mistake. We should have wrote settlement in here. Now it's worth noting that not all functions have a parameter that is passed in. Not all event functions have a parameter that's passed in. So for example, onPlug and load and these two functions that exist here by default, well, onLoad save file does, but onCreate save file doesn't either. So just be aware that not all of them are going to have it. But yeah, so we can, let's come back to this in a second. Let's just demonstrate this. So we can see now that settlement has a bunch of values. So for example, settlement name. So let's see if we can access settlement name. So we can write, let's create a new variable called settlement name, and that's going to be the settlement that's highlighted here, dot name. And let's print that out, settlement name. Perfect. So let's go back to the game. We will close the in-game console. We will reload our script again. We will open up the console, select the settlement, and we get the kind of region name slash in-game, in the files, the name for the settlement. So Anorian fields. Let's test it with another settlement. Let's try Minas Tirith. Anorian. Perfect. Okay, so we want to change the model. So again, let's go back to our function here. Strat map objects.set model. And rather than passing in these coordinates every time, we have the settlement that's, whenever we select a settlement, we have all the information about the settlement. So including the name, if we go back to the documentation, we can also see we have the X and the Y coordinates. So why don't we try passing them in, X coord, settlement dot Y coord. So we don't have to hard code them now. Now every time we select a settlement, hopefully, we should use these coordinates instead. And yeah, let's go back. So what else do we need for set model? I think we need the ID. Yeah, we need the two IDs. So I believe my understanding of this is that some models have two IDs. They have kind of like a inner and an outer wall sometimes, and I believe that's why there's two model IDs here. So you could change the inner but keep the outer, or change the outer but keep the inner, for example. But in this case, we're just going to keep it simple. We're just going to change the model. So if we go back here, go 1 and 1. And the reason we're picking 1 here is because when we added the model, we gave it an ID of 1. So we could go here, give this 2, and then we could change this to 2, you know, if this was a different cast file, for example. Okay, so let's give this a go. So go back to Medieval 2. We will reload the script now, and when we click on Minas Tirith, hopefully it should change the model. And it doesn't. Interesting. Ah, yes. I know why. Because the model actually isn't in the game, because we've written this code to run on plugin load, but since we wrote the code, we actually haven't loaded the plugin. So I'm going to close the game and reload the game, re-trigger this on plugin load function, which will add the model to the game, and then it should work. Okay, back in 2 seconds. All right, so now that we've had a chance for this code to run again here, because we restarted the game, we can load this model. I just want to make a point as well that I forgot to include this Ireland here in the path, so if you're following along, just make sure you have that. So now this should work. Let's test it out. Brilliant. So whenever we select a settlement, on settlement selected, we say that settlement was selected, we print the name of the settlement, and we set the model based on its X coordinates and its Y coordinates and this model ID that we added earlier. Simple. So now we've written some code to change the model whenever we select the settlement. So that's great, but it's not really something we probably want to add to our mod. You know, selecting the settlement and the model changes, that doesn't really make any sense. So why don't we pick something that makes a bit more sense to demonstrate what we want to do. So previously we're using on settlement selected, but if we scroll through here, we could do upgraded, but that's kind of does that in the base game already. So let's try something else. What about ungarrison settlement? And this triggers when the last unit has been removed from a settlement. Agents do not count. Okay, let's try that. So we'll copy this. This also has a settlement parameter, so we shouldn't have to change anything. Go back in here. Let's replace on settlement selected with on ungarrisoned settlement. Go back into the game, press Control 9-1, reload. So now the model doesn't change, but if we take all the units out,
ready your weapons.
You can see the model changes. Very cool. So perhaps your model has some tents in it when the soldiers are inside, and when you leave, it changes to a model with no tents or without banners or something interesting like that. Perfect. Now the only problem is this is also going to fire every time any general, or when,
ready your weapons.
You know, maybe we want different models for different areas or something. So rather than just blindly setting the model, what we should do first is check. We can chain some conditions. So our first condition is that all the units are moved out. Our second condition can be that the settlement name is West Osgiliath, for example. So if the settlement name is Osgiliath, then set the model end. Perfect. So let's try this. So we'll reload the script again. Go and find a settlement that's not West Osgiliath.
Captain of
all the troops
Gondor.
out. Perfect. Stays the same. Let's try it in West Osgiliath. Take all the units.
Ready your weapons.
Move them out. Perfect. It changes. Now there is a caveat to this. It's not an unfixable problem, but just worth being aware of, is that if I close the game now and I reopen the game, the model isn't going to be set, because if you can imagine, the setting of the model only occurs when we ungarrison the settlement. Now what we probably want to do is for that to persist. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that, but the way I'm going to show you is pretty simple, and it uses some helper functions that I've written and some other people have written that will make the process quite simple. So let's give that a go. So in order to maintain this model when we reload the campaign map, we can write a function. Sorry, when we reload the campaign map and when we reload the game, we can write or use another event that EOP uses or has ready for us, is campaign is on campaign map loaded. Yeah, perfect. So this one is called after the loading of the campaign map. So let's use this on campaign map loaded. Yes. Does it take any arguments? Let's have a look. It doesn't. So we can leave that blank. End. Lovely. And what we're going to do in here is we are going to add some more conditions. So let's say that just whenever we load the campaign map, we want to change the settlement. We're going to change the model again. So let's throw this in here. Actually, let's just comment it out for now. So we probably want to change the settlement if, imagine this was on upgraded settlement. Imagine this was on upgraded settlement, and when when we restart the game, the building, the fortress building, for example, is going to be built in West Osgiliath. And we want to make sure that this model stays the same if it has a fortress in it. So what we can do is we can go in here, and now the problem is we don't have access to settlement easily like here. So what we could do if we did have access to settlement is we could loop through, we could get the buildings equals settlement, buildings, whatever, and get all the buildings, and then we could loop through the buildings and check if any of the buildings are called fortress, and if they are, set the model. But we don't have access to that in this function here, in the scope of this function. We have nothing. What we do have access to is everything in the campaign map. So all the factions, all the settlements, all the units and all the armies, we have access to all that information. So what we're going to do in here is kind of iterate through all the factions and all the settlements and all the cities in the settlements, and then we're going to check if Gondor has a settlement called West Osgiliath. Does it have a building in it called a fortress? If it does, set the model of this location to the tree, the Elven city model. Okay, so first of all, how do we get the settlement structure? So I believe get settlement by name. Yes, so we have a helper function in here that I've written before. We're not going to go over this. Basically what it does is it goes through all the factions, and then it goes through all the settlements belonging to each of those factions, and it will return whatever settlement you want if you give it a name. So I'm going to take this function, going to paste it in here. We're going to do settlement equals get settlement by name, and let's say West Osgiliath. So now we have our settlement. Perfect. But we also want to check if the building is built in the settlement. So we have another helper function here, which is get building in settlement. Let's copy paste this, throw it in here. And we can see here that this returns the building that we want and the settlement. And the reason why we're adding this function in at the top here is because get building in settlement actually uses get settlement by name. And this function was written by Finn, so thank you for that. Yeah, so we actually don't need this one. We can just write building settlement equals get building in settlement, and we can see here this takes in a building name and a settlement name. So let's say our building name is West Osgiliath, our settlement name is, our building name is Fortress, and our settlement name is West Osgiliath. And what we want to do here, we want to set the model. So let's check if the building exists. So we have another helper function here that just checks if the building is actually there, if it's not null. So because if the building doesn't exist in the settlement, then it returns, this function returns nil. So we can do if building, sorry, that is not correct. If is not null, and we'll pass in the building. If the building exists, then do something. And what do we want to do? We want to set the model. Simple. And you can see here we have access to settlement, and we're going to pass in the x and y coordinates, set the model 1 and 1. Perfect. Let's give it a go. So I have closed the game. You can see here that there's no other kind of code here that's going to change the settlement. We've commented out our unupgraded settlement function. So the only thing that's going to run is our on-campaign map loaded. So let's give that a go. All right. So I've reloaded the game, and we can see here, because our city of West Fisgiliath has a fortress, we can set the model to something completely different whenever the campaign map is loaded. Very cool. So yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to show today, was just kind of how to get started with EOP, how to write some basic scripts, how to use the event functions like on campaign map loaded, on settlement selected, on settlement ungarrisoned, and how you can chain those together to create kind of whatever scenarios you want, basically. You could, change the settlement based on the turn number. So if it's divisible by 6 or something like that, then it's winter, and you could change the settlement to have the settlement model to have snow and ice on it. You could, if the ring was destroyed, for example, in Mordor over here, well, I don't think this is a, no, that's not a cast, but you could have Barad-dûr completely destroyed if the ring was destroyed. So you have access to, in EOP, event counters. You can get event counter values, and there's a bunch of other functions that you can use. So these are all the different type of events: on starting a siege, on giving money, on city riots. And changing the model is just one of the things, many things that you can do. So I hope that clears things up a bit more and gives you a bit more understanding of the things that you can do with EOP. And I will put all of the code and scripts in the description below, and links to the website, documentation, and Discord if you want to learn more or if you have any questions. So thanks again to UNI for creating EOP, and I hope you all can have some fun with it.